Our study continues today with Exodus chapter 19 and chapter 20. This is the second video devotional for today, and it will be taken from Exodus 20. Well, as you're going to notice, the focus of this study is the Ten Commandments. Well, let's pick up our study with very little introduction. Now, all of Israel witnessed the outward manifestation of God's heavenly glory as smoke and fire engulfed Mount Sinai. Now, we have already read in chapter 19 how the trumpet blast warned man, woman, and beast that none dare approach the mountain and live. Then, out of the midst of the mountain, we have read that the Lord was heard saying, I am the Lord, that is, I am Jehovah, the eternal, self-existent God. I am the Lord thy God, Elohim, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. Exodus 20, verse 2. Now, the Ten Commandments were part of the Lord's covenant with Israel, and the people were commanded to hear, heed, and obey them. Now, the first commandment states, chapter 20 and verse 3, Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Well, unlike the neighboring nations which worship innumerable gods, Israel was to worship one God, Yahweh. Now, the second commandment was, Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. In other words, you will not be like the other nations which worship nature itself, creatures of nature. Instead, verse 5, Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. Verse 6, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Well, unlike their neighbors, Israel was not to worship idols or images like Israel's God. Now, the people were warned that the family would, the sons and the daughters, would bear the guilt of their fathers for violating the second commandment and thereby invoke God's judgment. Verse 5. The third commandment reminded Israel that the essence of God's character was summed up in his name. We read, Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Exodus 20, verse 7. You see, God's name was to be honored and not spoken of lightly or in vain. Why is that? Because the name and meaning of Israel's God were to be hallowed. The fourth commandment served as a reminder that Israel's God was the Creator, and the Sabbath would serve as a day of rest and a memorial to his handiwork. Of the Sabbath, we read in verse 8, Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. Verse 11, For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested on the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath, and hallowed it. You see, the Sabbath day, the seventh day of the week, was dedicated to the Lord as a day of worship and rest. The fifth commandment moved the emphasis of the law and commandments from man's relationship with his Creator to his relationship with his fellow man. And so Israel was commanded, and I quote, Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Exodus 20 and verse 12. Well, because fathers and mothers represented God's authority, sons and daughters of Israel were to honor and revere their parents. Likewise, we read in Deuteronomy 27 and verse 16 that the elderly were to be honored and revered, and any who failed were condemned. And so the fifth commandment also, you'll notice, carried a particular promise and reward, and that is long life. The sixth commandment reminds us of the sanctity of human life. Exodus 20 and verse 13, thou shalt not kill. Well, because Adam was created in God's image, the life of man and woman were to be valued as sacred. The seventh commandment reminded Israel of the sanctity of marriage. And so the Lord commanded Israel, thou shalt not commit adultery. Exodus 20 and verse 14. And so it was from the beginning that God established marriage as a sacred covenant between himself and man and woman. Now the Creator ordained that man leave his father and his mother, cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Genesis 2:24. Now listen, as one flesh, the bond between a husband and his wife is not to be broken. So sacred is the institution of marriage that it actually, in the book of Ephesians, served in the New Testament as a picture of Christ's enduring love for believers and the church. Now, the eighth commandment, Exodus 20 and verse 15, established the right of ownership. It reads, thou shalt not steal. Thus, to take that which belongs to another, whether by theft or deceit, was a sin against God and man. The ninth commandment demanded that truth prevail. Exodus 20 and verse 16, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. You see, as God's people, we are to speak the truth. And libel, slander, or bearing false witness were and are grievous sins. Now, the 10th commandment stated, thou shalt not covet. And you might notice in that verse that it focused upon desires for that which belonged to another. And so we read, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Though manifested outwardly, covetousness is deeply rooted within the heart of man. And then notice the manner of worship that is required by a God who is holy, beginning in verse 18 and looking through verse 26. And so God, having forbidden idols and images of himself, the Lord was also concerned about the attitude and manner of those who approached his altar to worship and offer sacrifices. Therefore, steps were forbidden at the altar to preserve a modest, respectful decorum, lest any worshipers be perceived as immodest. So concerned was the Lord about modesty and the proper and respectful decorum that not even steps were located at the altar, that Aaron or others would have to climb the steps and perhaps their ankles or more of their leg be seen. You say, well, that seems to me to be insignificant, not to a God who is holy and quite honestly doesn't want his people distracted. Well, closing thoughts. The Lord's expectations for Israel's altar and his demand for modesty really should be instructive. Now, the priests were commanded to conduct themselves in a manner befitting the holiness of God. They were not to allow nakedness, that is immodesty, to distract those who worship the Lord. And then an observation on my part. Tragically, we live in a day in which anything goes seems to be the mode of worship in the 21st century church. And I fear little thought is given to the manner or style of worshiping a holy God. May you and I remember our God is holy. And by the way, he expects the same of you and me. Well, what a wonderful study it has been. We will continue looking at the law in the days that are ahead. I certainly appreciate you being a part of Heart of a Shepherd. God bless, and bye-bye.